Well, thank you all. This has been a great conference so far, and I really feel privileged to be invited amongst all you experts out there. I also noticed a great tone in the conference in that everyone seems to be very passionate about being involved in the space program, and I was too as a small kid, and then later on wanted to become an astronaut and all that sort of stuff, but that's ancient history, as they say right now. So my two co-authors, Lisa Westwood and Dr. Beth O'Leary, could not make it. Lisa is a cultural resource management, works for a firm, and Beth O'Leary is a New Mexico State University teacher at that point. I also remember what Jeff said earlier is, what are you doing historically? And it always reminded me of the movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they were about ready to blow up the Ark, and Indiana Jones was then asked by the German officer, one must know when you're just living through history or when you're creating history. So Dr. Jones, do you really want to blow up the Ark? So I think that's a good lesson, and I think Jeff was right on when he said that. So I'm going to go very quickly through here. I'm not going to rediscuss some of the other items, but sort of give you a little bit of a history of where we're coming from on some of these artifacts. So space heritage is rather unique. For us that are in architectural preservation, it's kind of a new venture for us because these are things that actually leave the Earth and then either come back or staying there. When we wrote the book, about 50 nations had things buzzing up in the air there. And now we have over 80 nations that have stuff up there. In fact, one paper that we gave in Hawaii about 10, 12 years ago, the gentleman spoke on what do we do with all that stuff out there? And when does it ever going to come down? So we have Wes Meixel from Langley here. He just introduced himself. There you are, out there. I went there a couple of times to look at some of the stuff, and it was kind of interesting because he said it was the first tour that he ever gave anybody. He was just a few months on the job, so he's here, which is great. But this is a variable density tunnel, 1922. Trying to investigate how flight works. And why variable density? Well, if any of you own planes and fly, I have a 1934 Stinson Reliant, big old round engine in it. And density then is really controllable on how you're going to maneuver your aircraft and later on your spacecraft. Because as the density grows, and it gets hotter or you get a higher altitude, the molecules move apart. And therefore, as the laminar flow comes back over the top of your wing, trying to create that negative pressure which lifts you up, as those molecules start to spread out, they just don't lift as good on it. And if any of you have taken off from hot days in any of your jets here, you'll notice they just don't seem to get off the runway, and they're just going and going, and that's because it takes more speed and more action to get off. And with a regular aircraft, it's a propeller. So this was really the first effect that really started some of the research into space. We have at the 2,000-foot rocket sled track at Edwards Air Force Base. And by the way, I've been very blessed, both being a California preservation officer and also being the chairman of the advisory council. I had access to a lot of these great places that a lot of people don't. And that's part of the problem we have with preservation on a lot of these sites, is the general public just doesn't get there. So you don't have the friends of the church down the street or the friends of this or that because they just never see it. And that's really a problem, and it will always continue to be a problem on that. So this 2000 thing was repurposed, and we just saw Kathleen give her talk about reusing things. They basically took this off and then moved it to Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, and then increased it to 5,000 feet for training of the astronauts. But this is where they tried to do experiments with chimpanzees at the time to see about basically compression as you would slow down this rocket. It was supposed to be used for V2 testing initially and stuff, so Lieutenant Colonel John Strapp, since it wasn't going very well with the chimpanzees, we lost some of them, he decided to strap himself to it anyway and go through there, which really led then to his own visions on what it would take in order to be either thrust from a rocket or in a deceleration. And then we've been very fortunate, the Pioneer Deep Space Station, 1958, was actually purchased by a university, Barstow Community College Space and Technology Center, and put in the middle of their campus. Now, you can see the size of that in their campus, but isn't this great to just walk out of your classroom and see something like this so you can tell? This was really the first time that we had tracking deep space vehicles on that. The Unitary Plan Wind Tunnel is still in operation. Most of these are success stories that I'm going to be telling to you. Again, 1956, the NASA wind tunnel, and almost every single Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft and the shuttle models were used to test this complex. We thought we were going to lose it, so part of the Section 106 process is basically NASA then decided to go ahead and have private testing done there. So it was incredible with this space tunnel. In fact, we even thought about having it turned into a housing when NASA was ready to give up. And I can't imagine living in a wind tunnel. Not in operation, of course, but I can't imagine it being there. So we had a Kathleen note that in 1990, NASA and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation worked closely, and we published this thing called Balancing Historic Preservation Needs with the Operation of Highly Technical or Scientific Facilities, which is very difficult, as most of you know, and how we do this in terms of really coming up with an adaptive reuse that we would want to do that. But following the National Park Service, the 1985 Man in Space National Historic Landmark Theme Study, which, by the way, we had a chance to work with its author, Harry Bukowski, when we're doing our books and stuff. And as most of you know out there, if you haven't heard, Harry passed away just 3 weeks ago. So it's a loss to all of us on that. But over the years, we worked very closely with NASA from ACHP in not only writing this, but coming up with a memorandum of agreement in 2011 with NASA, the National Park Service, and 4 historic preservation officers talking about the shuttle, saving the shuttles and the orbiters, and I'll talk about that later. I'm going to pass over this. Kathleen gave a really good review of this, and especially in terms of the reuse. Back to Langley Air Force Base. This is the Rendezvous Docking Simulator, built in 1963, pretty early in the Gemini and Apollo astronaut practicing their pilot control rendezvous and docking techniques. Very difficult because you're trying to remember, once you're in space, you don't have ailerons and other stuff to control your aircraft because there's just simply nowhere out there to offer their addition. So you have to do it with your little jets on there in order to move it around. So it was really kind of a unique first in several areas of doing this. In the simulator, you'll notice the picture of the Earth on the wall. And that was actually came back when part of the stimulator was used to give them more of how you dynamically control the vehicles in an environment that closely paralleled that of space. And one of the things that we found in Apollo 13, for instance, coming back to that, was Fred Halsey, who was the lunar module pilot, and Jim Lovell, who was the commander, all of a sudden found out that when they started to lose the controls on coming back on a lunar lander, is that everything was reversed. What was up was down, and what was left was right. And the only thing that was fixed in space at that time was the Earth. And part of that training came from Langley to do that. which I found fairly incredible. Again, going back to Langley on this was part of the Lunar Landing Research Facility, and it allowed the astronauts to fly in a simulated lunar environment. And Neil Armstrong and Aldrin and 22 other astronauts used this in order to understand what the last 150 feet of descent would feel like coming to the moon. And it was built in 1965, basically just an old airframe that nobody would really know what's really happening. And again, it's a reuse now. Rather than tearing it down, it's used for aircraft impact. This gives you sort of a simulation that was the lunar landing, and then also the many of the astronauts, because we're dealing with 1/6 the gravity, they also rigged it so that the astronauts could then train on cables and everything else to feel how it would be walking on the moon. This was one of the items that I tried very desperately to save both as SHPO and as the chairman of ACHP. This is the engine hot fire test at Alpha Test Stand at Santa Susana Field Laboratory. I know Roland has been there. How many other people have been to Santa Susana? Just one. Well, I got to tell you guys, this is an incredible site. Very much done in secret for the whole time, even when a lot of the solid fuels were shipped from Colorado by train, all covered up, and everything else. And then, of course, they got into the liquid fuel. This is the area where all of the rockets were tested, because the rockets had to be tested because of the tremendous vibration and everything else that would be shaking. So these are full stands. In other words, you could pretty much launch a rocket from there if it was built for that. And it was designed very similar to the way that Wernher von Braun, when he was doing his test rockets in Germany, is that you need to have a hillside that allows the hot gases to escape. Now, of course, from our launch pads that we have at Kennedy and Cape Canaveral and stuff, we make accommodations for that, and that's why you see that big blast out. Because if you just had a rocket sitting on the flat plane here and try to take off, it would basically go whoosh like that. So that was one reason why these hills up in Santa Susana, which is northeast of Los Angeles up near Van Nuys, was done on this. Now, all of these came down except one. And I'm going to give you, and I hope this thing works, it's going to be part of the Habs hair documentation. We tried to save it as a California state park, because when Boeing put all their facilities there, they had housing, they had a gymnasium, they had offices, they had all the facilities there, because when people would come there, they'd be there for 2 to 3 years. Buzz Aldrin had a chance to go there. I went there on about 15 different occasions. Things just weren't working out. We had tribal issues as well. That was very important to make sure that we mitigated on that. So we lost everything that was here. So when you see this fly through, and I hope it works, and by the way, this is an animated fly through. Basically, this was done on doing the CAD drawings and then putting it into an animation. It looks like a drone's flying around, but it's not a drone. This is a tremendous large area that was developed since 1947, which is amazing if you have never heard of it since 1937. Basically, NASA wanted to have to dispose of part of this real estate that we had here, and we just couldn't basically work enough in order to try to save it. So basically, this was part of the Habs hairs. You'll see some of the observation concrete structures that are there. The glass in that was 6 inches thick. I really wanted to have a piece, but they wouldn't give it to me. So it was just incredible. The site's contaminated, of course, because of a lot of the jet fuel and the blasting. Some of the stuff goes down 15 feet, but NASA had to clean it all up anyway before then. So we were hoping then that we would do this. I tried to convince them to just treat it as a ruin, if nothing else, because sometimes over time things get preserved when they're saved, even though you don't have the money in order to do this. It was, folks had tears in their eyes that worked there, because they're all in their young 20s and 30s years trying to come up and solve these problems. Just an incredible sight. And I guess Sandra's the only one in the room that's been there besides Roland. Sandra and Adam talked really good about this. I'm just going to do some personal stories on this because I think it was kind of fun. ACHP did provide the pass-through for $4 million. This was the only time that ACHP has done this, and nobody really knew that it existed. So I went to my executive director and asked him, and he says, gee, I don't know. And I said, well, John, you've been with the organization since it began for 45 years. You got to know something. He says, well, I think something happened like this. So anyway, we had Hal VR, who was our lawyer, look into it. And sure enough, we're the only agency that can do pass-throughs at that time, because I think when the law was written, that people could not give money, they could not donate money to almost all of the federal agencies on this. So just a couple of quick stories. As Dr. Abraham was saying in her thing, the stories are going to be gone. And I think it's important when you're talking to like Gene Kranz here and Jen Looney at the Johnson Space Center, as he's talking about us holding up his cell phone and saying, you have more computer, I don't know what you want to call it, power in your cell phone than we had at all the consoles at JSC and on board all the spacecraft at that time. And if you remember some of the stuff, guys are doing calculations, slide rules and stuff in order to make this work. And for young people, this is a hard thing to translate. I remember in my 11-year-old granddaughter that's going on 20, I think, you know, she has a cell phone, and I was showing her my slide rule because she was really interested in a STEM program. And she says, I can't believe you guys did this. And I said, well, that's what we had to do. So as these stories they start getting done, I did ask Gene Kranz how it was on Apollo 13 for the movie and stuff, because as I think somebody said, you know, he didn't say really that failure is not an option. Didn't even come close to it. That was basically Bill Boyes, the script manager in 1995, when he visited and talked to one of the flight controllers. I think it was Bostic, Jerry Bostic. But so he says, wow, how can I complain when Ed Harris is playing my part? So, so I thought that was pretty cool. We were sitting during the opening, which was great. It was a special invite. And we're sitting together, and he leaned over to me and he says, you know, I think what we ought to do is pipe in the smells that we had during Apollo 13 in terms of the rescue, because we were trapped there for a couple of days as we're trying to go through that. And besides the horrible smoke is the pizzas and the coffee grounds and the right clothing, he said, on everybody. And I said, I don't think that would be such a great idea. I don't know how many visitors you would have. But again, these stories are getting thin. So part of the consultation program, we do have the 3-year reports that come out of ACHP. We work with NASA in terms of progress reports on that. That started under the Bush administration. They thought that would be a good idea to have that. So I think that part of this, if you have a success story, like 39, I think it would be good, Launchpad 39, I think it would be good to go ahead and basically throw that out on that and see if you can get it published. Chris Daniels, who's from ACHP, he's a superstar. When I was there, still is a superstar. He's tied in with NASA. So if you have anything, do it. So that's what we're talking about, guys. Seriously. Now, young people can make that connection. My 11-year-old granddaughter can make that connection seeing that. But we have to preserve that somehow. I just don't know. They'll never have that experience unless we really try to save our history. All right, so this is Atlantis at Edwards. With the retirement of the fleet here, only Discovery was going to be moved to the National Air and Space Museum out at Hazy. I got really upset because one of my friends was the SHPO for Texas, Mark. I won't mention his last name. Sandra knows him, of course, because he's given me lots of tours of every time we've went there with him, and he's a good friend. But NASA was working him over, and the reason why, it was $20 million to safe-proof and secure each of these orbiters. That's a lot of money, $20 million per piece. And then, you know, what were they going to do with them after that? So working with 4 other SHPOs and ACHP, and again, being chairman was nice at that time, we basically sat down with NASA and we said, if we found people that would take these and pay for the delivery where you wouldn't, would you do that? And they said yes. And they didn't even hesitate, because NASA wants to save everything that NASA has. I remember talking to somebody at NASA headquarters when we were going through the book and I was going through the archives. And I said, you know, you guys really got to save more of this stuff. And I said, because everything is cutting edge. It's first time, it's incredible. And the guy looks at me and says, everything NASA does is that. What are we supposed to do, save everything? And I go, sure, why not, you know. So anyway, after doing that, it was great. And of course, I can't remember the car manufacturer when we got the Endeavor in California, towing it down the streets of Los Angeles to the museum in Expo Park and stuff. So, you know, they made a big deal about it. So one of the problems we had is with the interior. I remember when we got the SR-71 Blackbird coming down to the San Diego Air and Space Museum, I was so anxious to get into the cockpit and see what all the controls and everything was in there. So when they delivered it, even though they put it on a pylon outside of the museum, I got in there, it was empty. It had been completely cleaned out. Not even a seat was there. And I said, well, that's a really drag, because we wanted to keep these interiors. And they were very concerned about security. So basically what we did is we changed out all the consoles and we put fake stuff in the consoles. But otherwise, everything else was kept. So those ones that want to show. So Enterprise went to Intrepid Sea and Air Museum in New York City, because New York had a lot to do with the space program, believe it or not, and they paid for it. Discovery, of course, went to the Smithsonian. Atlantis went to the Kennedy Space Center down here. Endeavor came to California. And of course, as you know, Columbia was lost. And poor Market, Texas, well, they got the transport aircraft that would take the planes from Edwards Air Force Base back here. Sorry, Mark. All right, so preservation we found works best when it's local. So when I was SHPO, I had not been there too long when Beth O'Leary and Lisa Westwood came into my office. And Lisa said to Beth, well, this should be easy. And first of all, I looked up from my desk and I said, well, first of all, who are you and why should this be easy? Well, I had a model of the lunar lander on my desk. They had already been to National Park Service and could not convince them to basically name the 106 objects on the moon that Beth O'Leary got a wonderful grant from NASA to survey, to find out how much is there, including the P bags and everything else that's on there. So anyway, they came to us and he says, you know, we understand you really like the space program and stuff. Can you put it on your state register? And I said, well, you know, the moon's 233,000 miles away, so I'm not sure if that's going to happen. So I went to my director. She was very hesitant about doing this. In fact, she was pushing back quite a bit. She says, I'm going to be on the Jon Stewart show, the Daily Show, you know, it's dressed in a spacesuit, you know, and it's going to be the laugh of California. Anyway, Schwarzenegger was the governor at that time. He's the one that appointed me, and he said, great, in kind of an accent, but yeah, he was really, really good at doing that. So anyway, we did it. I talked to the commission, and it was just super. It went through in passing colors. We did find that we had the USS Catalina down in Mexico in the waters, and it was still on our register. So we put it on our register, and then New Mexico did it, part of Florida did it, Alabama, and then Texas has a different way, but they also did it, and then Hawaii. Things have to be in Hawaii to do it. So they basically did a resolution for it as well. So we're looking now at trying to make this a transboundary serial nomination for a World Heritage Site, the entire moon. We have several countries, of course, as you know, have a lot of stuff that's up there. Beth was very instrumental working with NASA for making sure that anything that goes to the moon, this was during the Google X Prize where they wanted to send up the robots. Remember, the robot had to go 500 feet and take things. Well, where are they going to send them? Well, sure, they're going to send them in tranquility and probably run over the first footprint on the moon. So we're trying to do that. And of course, it's been successful, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about it tomorrow, is we finally got in 2021 the first time that at least the USA has recognized passing a bill called One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage in the Space Act. So we're sort of the first nation to recognize the existing of the human heritage in outer space, at least in a formal thing, because as you know, the earlier treaties that we had is that basically the moon is off limits to for any nation to keep. So it's been sort of a long haul to get there, but we feel good about it. So a lot of stuff is up there in very different types of conditions as well as on that. It's estimated there's probably 200 metric tons of cultural material just on the moon itself. So let me finish up here because I know everybody's anxious to get a lunch and get out to the tour. So don't we all wish? Huh? All right, well, thank you.